Welcome. You're listening to Project After Architecture, a podcast dedicated to shed light on the experiences and perspectives of architecture graduates. In our very first episode of this season, we're in conversation with Vaissnavi Shukl, a graduate of Harvard Graduate School of Design, recipient of Graham Foundation, creator of Architecture Off Center podcast, and the founder of her eponymous architecture and design practice in Ahmedabad.
Hi Vaishnavi.
Hi Bharat, hi Siddhi.
Hi Vaishnavi.
So now I would like to start with asking you the first question, which is basically, we start with introducing a person's early career and education. So Vaishnavi, we have stalked you enough to know that you went to CEPT. After that, you also were a part of ETH Zurich for student exchange program. And after that, you interestingly went for a MDes program at Harvard.
Yeah.
So it's quite a journey, education wise, and it is something that fits perfectly when it comes to a designer's education background. I would like to ask you, how was your experience in your early days? How has CEPT, Harvard, and ETH Zurich played a part in framing your design thinking? And how do you look at your early days, basically? You know?
I mean, I think when we talk about early days, an important part, very important part is actually my internship in Sri Lanka with Palinda Kanagra. And that has shaped a lot of my design thinking, or at least the design sensibilities. Except, of course, as we know it, it's changed in terms of its curriculum now, in terms of the studio structure and how they uh, have structured broadly the Bachelor's of Architecture program. But then a decade ago, when I was there, it was still focused a lot on learning by doing. So it was very hands on. Everything that you learned was through your workshops, through your basic design courses, through your studios. And that's the kind of broad pedagogy that existed. Your studios were all structured, very hierarchical, and with that experience, the first professional environment that I stepped in was in Sri Lanka at Sir's office. And it was instantly very humbling, because you realize that everything you've done in the last 3 years, talking about design, being fascinated by buildings and architects, adds up to nothing if you don't know how to build a building, right? And studios are infamous for not teaching you how buildings are built. I mean, you'd have a course, fine, but so the first day of office, you go in and he just gave us working drawings of an extremely large hospitality projects in one of the villas, and he's like, okay, you have to do working drawings for that. And it was a steel structure. Until date in my life, I have not been confident of doing steel structures, is because it's a lot of detailing, and studios don't talk about that, right? You'd probably do a wall section here and there in your sixth semester, but you don't really get to learn about different aspects or factors or players that come into effect when you're doing a real life project. And so those 6 7 months were a crazy ride in terms of one learning what practice and office is. And I think it has a very deep impact on the way I practice now, is because we had a very lovely, healthy working environment. We started office at 8:30 in the morning, would leave by 5. We were not working on weekends. It was a very small firm. I could always turn to my right and ask my senior, but I was still doing the same kind of work she was. It was not hierarchical in terms of the work we did. And it really kind of you made me realize that architecture or architecture practice and education doesn't have to be about staying up late at nights and just logging yourself through very, very painful hours. So when I finished my internship, it was such an experience, enriching experience, I would say, that I first stopped doing all night outs. I was like, I'm not staying up at night because the number of hours you would put in the studio or the number of hours you would stay up had no correlation to the kind of work you would produce. And then right after my internship, I of course went to ETH, and that's where I think there's a little bit of a interest and kind of love affair that began in terms of exploring history and theory. CEPT, of course, had fabulous teachers who taught us history and theory. So we had Riaz Tayyabji, Meghal Arya, everybody who's practicing as well as teaching, Neelkant Chaya, and we had all these people teach us history, lovely history lessons. And then suddenly, when you go to ETH, you had actual writers who were doing hardcore theory. You were not really focused on how Mughal buildings have evolved over time and kind of do a genealogical study of that, but really start asking questions about how do we process architecture, how do we write about architecture, how do we think about the ideas that are going through somebody's mind when they are putting pen to paper. And that's where I started getting interested in the theory lot a little bit more, because I just come from like a very practice heavy internship. And so after all of that, when I came back on campus for my final year, I of course did a design thesis and then I did a research thesis. And for my research thesis, I was like, okay, enough of site study design, let's do an absolutely theoretical research thesis, which was a comparative study of two architectural treatises, right? So I was looking at Palladio's four books of architecture, and I was looking at a very old Sanskrit text called Mayamatam, and starting to question how architecture is codified, because they are both practice heavy in terms of they tell people how to build. It's an instruction manual for laymen essentially, but it still codifies architecture in a certain way without directly talking about design. The big word that we use. So, with all of that, when I graduated, for some reason, I had already, while doing this very theoretical thesis, started picking up freelance projects on the side. And I was also teaching studios in CEPT, and I was doing way too many things. I was also working on a project with the CEPT archives. We were doing a exhibition and research archival project on Arvind Talati, who was a contemporary to B.V. Doshi and worked in Corbusier's office, but never got the kind of limelight that other modernist architects in India did. And just as a disclaimer, nobody in my family is an architect or remotely related to the construction field, like remotely. And so it started on the side with just like, side gigs of doing kitchen renovations and bathroom extensions and, like tiny little room projects while I was exploring all these large modernist ideas of how, low income housing in the 60s and 70s shape how Ahmedabad came up, and extremely two different worlds. And I think that kind of reflects in what I do right now as well, because on one hand, when we talk about architecture of center, is a very research focused um, venture, and then the practice has absolutely no relation to it. So I've been juggling into these two different worlds where people keep asking if there's ever been a linkage between the two. But now when I look back, I think I've been interested in both, and there has never been a linkage between practice and theory. I'm okay not having a linkage, but that's just how it's been. So with all of those multiple different experiences in the undergrad, I by the time I decided I wanted to apply, I think at least one thing was clear, that for me it was a strategic move in a sense to go abroad and probably get an additional education, because I knew I always wanted to practice. And with no family backing, I knew as a young female architect, if I were to go out in the world and start picking up projects, it would either take me a really long time to do that, or of course, you invest in additional education that can allow you to even teach in the future and kind of give you that verification tick mark on, like this girl knows something, like she's had that academic qualification, and you're okay to trust her with her project should you choose to give it to her. But then when it came to selecting a program, I think again it's been a dichotomy of sorts, except because it's been so design heavy, um, We did so many studios. I realized that one, nobody can teach you how to design. Studios and schools can teach you skill, so it can focus on skill building. But I wanted to take those 2 years to focus on thought building, which is why when I was looking at programs and exploring programs, I decided not to apply for a studio based program because it takes away a lot of your bandwidth that you could otherwise invest in inquiries that you would not be able to do justice to if you were focused so much on your skill building. And so that's where like the history theory part continued. So it went ahead, did a master's in history and philosophy of design. And even while I was doing that in the summer, I worked with an artist, did some more design practice stuff, and then have been juggling both these worlds since. That's a long answer to a very short question.
That is really diverse set of experiences, I would say, and one of the overarching theme of this entire answer was that, you try to juggle your practice with your research part, and still there was some kind of disconnect between the two. One question that has been at the back of my mind since a long time is, since we started this broad podcast, since we even started InDepth, was that, what was that urge into you that you wanted to question about design or maybe have conversations online that made you start architecture off center? For us personally, we love to have conversations. We always thought that there isn't a lot of conversation around design and practice in Indian context, to be honest. Um and also, it is 100% true, juggling practice and conversation and research and theory altogether is a difficult thing to do. So, with your diverse set of experiences at all these different places, did it in a way shape this thought process, or did it, provoke this urge of going towards, architecture off center?
No, I think architecture of center was a happy happenstance. And it had, I mean, it started with no intention of, highlighting the different things that people who belong from non-design backgrounds are doing to shape the world around us. No, it did not start with any of those. It just so happened that I finished, well, wrote all of my thesis and graduated during COVID. And with the hefty check that we had written for that American education, there were no jobs for me to apply to. So it kind of hits you in the face knowing that in a in a global health emergency of sorts, all those fancy things that you spent the last 8 years talking about, your undergrad, your masters, and the time in between, essentially is not on anybody's priority list. The only firms in the US that were hiring were very small boutique firms based mostly out of California, New Hampshire, and Vermont, which were building single family homes in the countryside for people who were living in the city. That was the only building typology that was booming in mid 2020. All the other large firms had let go of half their staff, if not more. Any opportunity that I would have wanted to explore in an otherwise normal world basically did not exist. And so the school, of course, you keep blaming the school for everything, like we do is in architecture, is like, yini hua, it's the school's fault. This doesn't happen, the school didn't do it. And same, so the school from their side, would do a lot of these webinars about how to make the most of your time while you're looking for jobs. They would say, oh, and that ranged from everything from focus on self-care, which is a very woke American East Coast Ivy League school idea, to saying, why don't you, speak to people who are doing what you're doing right now, build relationships, start networking. Of course, the world will return to normal, and that's when you can mobilize all your connections. And I'm here on an F1 visa, I don't have forever to just like sit and pay rent and like wait for that job to come to me. So in all of that, I was just talking to a lot of people, not random people, but people I knew, about how they had used either their architectural background to do something else, essentially pivot, which is your project after architecture, is how do you really pick different career paths. And at the same time, also look at people who did not have an architecture background but were somehow involved in world making broadly. And while I was having these conversations, of course, I would social distancing and go for a walk along the river, and then you end up talking about everything. And so after a couple of those conversations, I was like, well, if I'm having these conversations, I'm sure there's somebody out there who might be having the same thought and might benefit from just knowing what the possibilities are if you were to pivot either from design towards non-design. I mean, take like a whole career switch, or somebody who could use the information of not having an architectural degree and still be actively involved. And that's how I just like, okay, well, if I'm doing this and if half of these conversations are on Zoom, let me just record it, put it together, give it a little bit of a structure, and put it out as a podcast. Now, of course, by the end of it, I had already started working with the same artist that I was working with in the summer, and I was working remotely. And of course, rents were ridiculous. So I was like, okay, I don't have to be in the US to do that. So I moved back to India, was still working in the US late night. And the first episode I recorded after, talking to a lot of people about podcasting and learning how to do it and this and that, was when I'd already moved back to India. And I already had gotten COVID and I was quarantining. And because I was so bored sitting in the room for 14 days, I thought, let's just do it. And that's how I did the first episode. So the entire first season is everybody I know firsthand. Like literally your friends in your first circle. And then once I started doing it, I actually kind of enjoyed it. I was like, okay, now that I'm back in India, now that I'm not teaching, now that I'm not learning, I had stopped reading because I read so much for 2 years, just all your weekly readings and your books and writing thesis and stuff. So a little bit of a FOMO of not being in that intellectual bubble anymore, because I'd started practicing by then, again picking up freelance projects, and those conversations revolved around, your site level stuff with contractors and plumbers and carpenters, and no fancy big words. So that FOMO was like, okay, well, if I keep on doing this, at least I'll read something before interviewing someone. And if I'm talking about somebody's book or somebody's work in a refugee camp, I'll at least have to read something to inform myself. So it started as a very selfish project. And anybody who's done a podcast will know that you can only do it as a labor of love because there's no money to be made out of it. And so the second season started with a little bit of a structure. I was like, okay, well, what if I make it thematic, purely selfish again, just things I would have wanted to talk about. Set a little bit of like parameters in terms of, okay, we're not talking about building projects. Like we're not talking about architecture as a physical standalone object and talk about what led you to design this building. There's enough of talks and lectures about those on all architecture school ka YouTube platform. We're not doing that. So it started as a absolutely selfish project. And then of course you get interested and you start enjoying it. And that's when I think Ayushi also came on board to help with the research. And yeah, we're here 6 seasons and almost 4 years later. But no agenda, no broad theme whatsoever.
Now that is an incredibly honest answer, Vaishnavi, and that's why we love it. Because even on print, we say that we identified a niche and we sound very academic about it, but on at the very core, even Project After Architecture was basically a need to talk to people about and to mitigate this confusion about what to do after architecture, the confusion that we felt on the inside. And we would talk to different people and realize that, what, if this is helping us, this could also help somebody else,
Correct.
along the, and maybe in the future as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I see that there are very similarities between the thought process that we had for both of these creations. But yet again, Architecture Off Center, I think, stands out because you were able to bring such diverse viewpoints, okay, which are not only restricted to architecture. there's this misinterpretation that architecture is a very niche field and it is only for designers or for people belonging to the construction industry or the academicians who are related to architecture. But the people that you got onto the show, which included social workers and authors, anthropologists who are not directly related to architecture but are interacting with the fabric of architecture through their everyday work and nuances with people and with the topics that they deal with. And I think that was very, very beautiful. But yeah, in one of your answers, you also mentioned about balancing between practice and pedagogy, and these are two different worlds. I agree. How do you switch between the two? Because you tend to do it very seamlessly. You talk about practice, which is a very different world. Okay, you have to speak with the people who are involved very closely with the construction industry and market. And then when you come to the pedagogy part of it, you are involved in discourse making. You have to know the intellectual, you have to know the concepts with which you can maintain a conversation with academics and scholars. And that switch is sometimes what I also find very challenging, that once I am involved in this particular sphere, to switch back to practice, it takes quite some time
Not,
to
no, I
transition.
don't think it's seamless. It's just that it's been compartmentalized quite efficiently. In the sense, I mean, right from scheduling, which is, I mean, site work takes up most of it. It's 9 to 6, 9, 10 to 7. I'm in the office. I schedule my podcast recordings and stuff for after hours. So, I mean, that aside, yes, it's not that easy, which is why, I mean, after graduating from the GSD, a friend and I, Karan and I, we taught about 2 or 3 summer winter schools at CEPT, and we taught a master studio as well. And what I realized when we'd actually started teaching the studio is that it was very enjoyable, very fulfilling, um, very insightful in terms of us having to learn while teaching. But I realized I couldn't do it while setting up a young practice because teaching is so intensive, and because, I mean, the CEP system requires about 12 hours of contact hours, which is your teaching hours every week. And Karan would fly in from Delhi to do that. We were in studio 2 days, 6 hours at a stretch. And from a week, giving 2 days to teaching while building a young practice, maintaining the client side, site side, and my and the office side. There's a team in the office as well. I thought was very exhausting, which is why when they offered us to teach again, I couldn't do it because I realized that would be spreading too thin. But that said, I think people, I mean, from time ago have been able to do both quite efficiently. I mean, you see any of your professors at JJ for CEPT, of course, there's a lot of people who've been working and teaching and do that together. It's relatively easier if you're doing a design studio because you're able to bring your design experience into. But yes, if you're doing a seminar, since we taught a master's studio in the history, and it's called the architectural history. Wait, the program just got renamed, but it's a master's in history and theory at CEPT, and we were doing the second year studio, so the third semester. It was not a design studio because you can't teach design in a history masters. It was almost like a seminar, but imagine a seminar being run for 12 hours every week. So that required us to do as much preparation to make sure that we could have that kind of output in the studio. Apart from that, I think the podcast is relatively easy because you're able to get time off on the weekends, and rather than doing your recreational reading or watching Netflix, you're motivated enough to follow up and make sure your timelines are met, make sure your scheduling is done. But yeah, again, it's compartmentalized. They don't necessarily speak to each other, uh, but they both kind of satisfy different parts of your brain, your different selves of an architect.
That's very interesting. Compartmentalization for efficiency, so that you can switch into one and completely forget about the other and give yourself completely to one of the sections that
That's
you're
just
looking.
who I am as a person in general. So for me, it's easy. And I'm absolutely okay the two never interacting. I'm sure for others you would like there to be some kind of dialogue between the different things you're doing.
Mm,
I'm fully okay things being like separate.
yeah. Because I've seen that in a lot of practices, people like to bring these two different worlds together, and right at the edge conditions of these two compartments, something very interesting emerges for them. That liminality, that space of transition is where a lot of creation of new knowledge comes about.
See that happening mostly when it comes to design. If you
Mm-hmm.
see or if you look at the work of your faculty who is engaged in your courses or your seminars, your non design courses, apart from your studio, you'd see that knowledge production often is very isolated. So, for example, if you have a faculty who's, I don't know, many years or decade worth of work has focused on mapping a certain precinct in Mumbai, for the lack of a better example, you'll see that it doesn't often convert to or translate into a action oriented design project. It often stays as a theoretical subject, the output of which is not studio design related, but could be in the form of other means of production, whether it's an exhibition, whether it's a book, um, whether it's going on board to become a feature writer for like a newspaper. And so that research often of course comes out in different forms. It doesn't probably always translate into a design project, but I would
Mm-hmm.
not discount it for a lesser form of production just because it doesn't translate into design. I think with studios, if you're a practicing architect, it's relatively easier because you would have found a space for you to explore things in your practice and yet be motivated enough to have those kind of engaging design conversations with students in the studio. I think it becomes slightly more difficult if you're engaged in a research project because your motivation mm, can get.
That is a very interesting conversation right here, the compartmentalization. I would just like to ask you, two small questions about the same. The first question would be that you said that you were first in Sri Lanka for your internship, then you came back to India, then you went to Europe for your student exchange, then you were placed in United States, and that's a lot of different exposures, to be honest, right? Towards practice, towards theory, towards research. While listening to some of your podcasts, for example, one of the podcasts I would like to highlight is, the afterlives of orbital infrastructures. It was such mind-boggling theory right there. The amount of research that was happening, and architects relating to this particular design problem was just something we couldn't think about, right? Then I went on MIT Media Lab's website to, I just ended up there researching about the topic I just heard about. And there was indeed a connection between how NASA has recruited certain architects to, even SpaceX for that matter, to design for the future, to figure out how regolith can, basically shape settlements on Moon. So, my question directs towards this understanding of yours between this diversion or compartmentalization between practice and theory in different contexts. Do you find it to be different at different places? Uh, how is the socio-economic status of that particular context relate to that difference between practice and theory, Like, for example, somewhere like in Europe, where I've generally heard practices engaging into a lot of R&D, into a lot of practice where they try to bridge the gap between both. Certain things might not relate to similar practices in India, right, where we are still stuck in the basics. So, how do you look at this bidirectional approach? How do you look at this compartmentalization in different contexts?
I think this has to do with like the larger education system and the structuring of profession in different countries. Um, let's just do a. I think it's simpler to do like a US India comparison, right? The way education is structured in India is that at the age of 16, when you finish high school, you are expected to have clarity on what you are going to do for the next step of your life, right? I wouldn't even say 16. 16 is when you finish your 12th grade. 14, that's when you decide whether you want to study math, whether you want to do biology, whether you want to do commerce, you want to do arts, broadly speaking, in the state boards. And from there, you find your funnel into the next step of your life. Okay, so if you're going to become a doctor, you can't have not studied biology and be expected to give your NEET and stuff, right? So, very early on, what we do in our education system is we start pushing people to pick careers or to pick professions. And you don't really allow people to have the kind of flexibility to explore what the different options are out there in terms of pursuing a professional career or path. The American system, on the other hand, allows you to pick and choose things that you like from very early on. So, school, you say you like biology, you do biology AP. You say, I also like history. And so you can major in something and you can minor in something. And I've seen wild majors and minors, including places like Harvard College, where somebody would be majoring in neuroscience and have a minor at the Berkeley School of Music, focusing on performance something. Now, of course, the two at the face of it are not related, but students are able to figure out linkages between the two in terms of whether how music affects brain development, how music affects healing, how music affects growth, and you are able to chart your own path. And so when you graduate, you can start finding your niche. Either you do music, or you do neuroscience, or you do a combination of two, and maybe even do a master's in public health. Broadly, then get involved in policy making and start pushing your experience from both. We don't have that kind of freedom or leeway to do that in our country, right? The second thing that also comes into play, not just architecture, is the amount of funding that is available for research. If you were to carve your own career path, whether that's through research or through practice, you'll have to start somewhere. And because ours is a country that is still trying to allocate funds to more basic needs of the human society, you'll find plenty of articles that talk about how funding is not available for research in universities. Now, of course, yes, there has been a push towards, different IITs. The number of IITs have increased, the number of IIMs have increased, the number of NIDs have increased. And so in the broader national education policy, there has been a push to find research to enable more innovation. That has been happening since decades in these extremely well endowed universities whose endowment is equal to or more than GDP of multiple countries. So, students, if you want to make your own path, you're able to ask for funding, apply, get it, and do your thing, which is pretty much similar to how the Media Lab works. Is you have sponsors for different projects, and then you can do your own lab and you do your projects, and then you go sell that idea into the real world in a nutshell. In terms of architecture itself, you see people doing fabulous research projects when it comes to their thesis because it's an academic requirement. You will see very large firms initiating projects because they have the bandwidth to funnel money from the larger actual office projects and do some in house research and then initiate a project and propose it to the government. But a young firm, if you're just out of college, imagine the kind of resources in terms of time, mainly because all the time you put into a research project is time you're not paid for until, of course, eventually later then you grow and then you kind of make it back. It's that resource that is where there's a little bit of a But then again, there are practices who've done it. My juniors from CEPT compartment S4, 8 of them got together, started finding problems, started proposing it to panchayats, municipal, little tiny villages in remote places. They went and said, "You need this. We are going to help you build it." Started building it, and that's how they started their practice. Now, of course, they spread across 3 cities and do everything from restaurants um, to gaushalas to now urban regeneration projects. But started from that idea that, well, if we can't get projects, let's make our own projects. But not everybody has the liberty to do that. Motivation, yeah, everybody's motivated to do it. You are enthusiastic, but to follow it through, I think becomes a little tricky, and that's a bigger difference between just education systems between our country and like the Western countries.
That is a very good topic to touch upon, education, pedagogy. So you were talking about how someone who has a minor in music can have influences in architecture or his or her thought process. Right? It kind of works both ways, right? Like if
Mhm.
different spheres of ideas come together, they influence each other to grow. They provide new perspectives for one to grow their own thought process, and the thought process is basically an intellectual output in form of a practice. So I just got reminded about this one conversation I was having from someone from MIT. In fact, I was just explaining that person about the kind of projects that we have done here and the context that brought upon the challenges in front of us. And the person was quite fascinated by the amount of challenges, by the amount of different contextual perspectives we have here in India, right? And his opinion was that, if you just go deeper into what is happening in the context of India, particularly as a country, there is much to deep dive into. There is so much potential of creating different perspectives, nurturing them, bringing them together, and creating something new out of them. Which also brings me to this question of how how do you think the ideal process should be for Indian pedagogy, Indian practice from here on to kind of go towards that direction of, creating a well thought out, very well nurtured thought process, which is exposed to a lot of perspectives together and bring it to practice, you know? And I'm asking this in the context of how we as architects will play a role, say, 40 years from now in case of India, like looking at the urbanization rate, we are growing thrice in our cities' sizes in the next like 40 years to come. And what we think, what we put out as an intellectual exercise will be the face of India towards the world, right?
Hmm.
So the pedagogy, the kind of output we create here, directly relates to how India is seen by the world 40 years from now. So, what is your thought process regarding this?
See, I think regardless of the education, people who are motivated enough have found avenues to do the stuff they want to. Now, with the boom in the startup economy, you'll find so many architects actually being involved in grassroots level work and have ended up getting funding from international organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the WHO, and they're doing quite well. So even if you look at the bare minimum issues like questions of housing, questions of sanitation, there is a lot of also CSR that is now enabling projects where people who are motivated enough are able to do stuff, right? So you have Vedidam Foundation, which is doing work on sanitation. Um, my senior from CEPT, who also went to MIT, is uh, working. I mean, he started up a company called Bandhu, which is looking at housing for the migrant laborers. And there's a lot of people who are doing the kind of mission driven work that needs to be done. So I'm not by any chance discounting the fact that if you've had a certain kind of education, you can't do certain things. I think if you're motivated enough, you can still do it with or without a master's degree. um, And there are a lot of firms who are also doing those kind of research inquiries or innovative experimental work that you would see in, say, European or American practice center. Graduates from SPA Delhi. We had Dipanshu Gola, who co-founded an initiative practice, well, I don't know what to call them, called Architecture for Dialogue. And they have been doing a lot of very cool, edgy, uh, innovative work in terms of experiential design, in terms of integrating technology into the projects that they're doing. So it's happening. Uh, the only thing I would probably say that, again, that's also happening is, to have that flexibility in terms of choosing and making your own academic path. And we don't often have the freedom to do that. CEPT has started doing it. So, in the way they've structured their studios, also now the studios fall into three broad categories. Some focus on building design and detailing, some focus on visualization. I don't know what the third category is, but there are these types of studios. You have to do one of each for sure, but then you can deep dive into the kind of studio that interests you more. So if you're somebody who really likes working on site with material, you can go do the construction and the whatever detailing studio. Somebody who is more interested in the pure design part of it can do a visualization and communication studio more. And of course, now I think universities, I don't know about the others, have started offering an exit as well. If you realize architecture is not for you,
Yeah.
right? So 3 years, at the end of 3 years, you can take a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture and then go do a UI UX design, go do graphic design, go do filmmaking. We've seen all of our seniors do those crazy, quirky things after spending 7 years in architecture, right? Because infamously, that's what it would take for you to graduate. And they've gone on to become fashion designers and filmmakers and set designers and everything around it. So it's possible. They have gone on to become heads of uh, World Bank. I mean, the current president of CEPT is somebody who worked at the World Bank. It's possible. It's just that if there's any way we could shorten that time of exploration, and if you know early on this is for me or this is not for me, and if you can deep dive into it, I think people would graduate with a lot more interest in what they want to pursue next, not be left jaded with a forceful 5 year regimental architectural education that they know they're not going to use in the future. So that kind of a slightly liberal art perspective of selecting the courses that you want, doing the kind of things that you want. A thing that I really enjoyed during my time at the GSD was going and taking classes in other schools. I took a class at the business school. I took a class at the Harvard Kennedy School. I took a class at MIT. And you'll be surprised at how those classes and the kind of things that they talk about in those classes has relevance to your little tiny understanding of architecture, right? So there's linkages everywhere. It's just that we need to broaden the the scoop of ice cream of flavors so that people can try as much as they want before deep diving into one.
I wish that even the 5 year education that we had in architecture was this plural and allowed for that multiplicity of skill development that is not just restricted to architecture. It's because you get to, like you said, you get to explore so many things, you get to discover skills that you thought you never had just because you're exploring these different niches and disciplines. Which again brings me to ask that it's usually in an academic environment that you get to explore all of this multiplicity. And you also said earlier that exercising creative abilities, it's kind of like a luxury even in practicing, which is something that you get to do in academic environment, but not so much when you're working in the field in practice, because then you have to cater to clients, to the requirements, constraints, and objectives of commercial and residential projects. So in that case, with as somebody who values creative expression and liberty so much, how do you find that negotiation while interacting with projects that are of a commercial value with clients? and their needs and their expectations? How do you do it?
It's tough, I won't lie. And anybody who I interview for, who wants to join the team, and you ask them what they enjoy about architecture, they're like, I love designing. And that's when I give them a little spiel saying, listen, design is 10% of your project. You do your design, your typical studio design, and it's frozen, and you have to move on from it really quick. So the other 40% then is having the technical ability and the skill to execute that design, right? So which happens in your working drawing stage, because everybody comes with this enchanted idea of making wonderful SketchUp models and sitting on tracing paper and doing all of that. We don't do that in our office. We do chop chop chop, design, presentation, design, done, frozen, okay. Then design isn't everything. It's in your lighting layout, in your flooring layout, in your bathroom design. So I wish, first of all, that we kind of get disenchanted by what design and architecture means, and realize that there is design in everything that you do. So the 40% is knowing the technical know-how of how the building is going to stand, make sure water doesn't come inside the building, make sure the plumbing works fine, all the technical know-how. And I can't emphasize enough, but I think 50% of my practice at least is purely people management and having people skills and communication, because you are juggling between three different nodes, right? So the practice is here, but the practice is interacting with the client, the practice is interacting with the contractor, and the practice is interacting with the team that is involved in the practice. And so between all of this, it's 50% people skill in terms of how do you negotiate design decisions with the client, your financial decisions with the client, how do you make sure you produce the kind of drawings or details that are required on the office side to be executed on the site. And so it's this constant juggling. And oftentimes I'll speak to my friends as well who have their practices, saying there are days when I feel like a manager more than I do as a designer, because you're constantly just handling people. And because it's a small team for me, I don't have like a dedicated project manager who'll be like, okay, I'll take care of all of this, you design, I'll take care of execution. It's that one person playing all the roles. So it's not easy. It can get very overwhelming very fast. And which is why I also keep on emphasizing the fact that you can be a wonderful, wonderful designer, but if you're not somebody who can manage, or if you're not a people person as much, your day to day in practice becomes very, very difficult if you're so idealistic, because you have to, at the end of the day, the way I approach it is you have to listen to what the client says. At the end of the day, yes, it's your interpretation of the client's ambition and you're giving it a certain physical form, but it can't be just hardcore me. Like, it can't be 100% me. It's constant negotiation every day about everything, and that negotiation also happens in the office between me and whoever's working on that project, between my team members, of how do we do it, what are the different alternatives for this, which is the best alternative for this, how do we communicate this. And then negotiating again on site in terms of making sure that your vision is met with and is executed without wastage of material, with all economies kind of optimized in terms of timeline, in terms of money. And so it's a lot of management. But at the end of the day, having done all of that, if you still get a smile on your face when you're standing on site, or if are able to sleep well at the end of the day when you see your project complete, I think it's worth it. But it's a lot of like people work.
One other question that I'd like to ask, which is along the similar lines of working and managing people, is about being a young woman architect, headlining an architectural practice, your experience working with contractors and construction workers. because of course there's the social cultural makeup and construct of a male dominated industry at large. So how do you has that changed over time for you? Have you watched a difference between when you started off and how you were received, and if there's any difference between how you have kind of navigated through this experience?
This can be a whole different conversation, but we'll keep it short. Yes, I was the first project that I actually took up. I was 22 or 23. I was doing there was a spare room in my friend's house, and her mother wanted to make it into a studio. That's how it started. And it's not easy because I think that the most supportive thing I've had across these many years of practice is one, I've always had my clients respect me for decisions I took. And seeing that respect from the client towards me many a time reinforced how the contractors would treat me or how they would look at me. But in the initial days, because you don't have a team, I mean, of course, not in office, like on site, your usual set of contractors. After a couple of years, you know your contractors, you know different agencies and different consultants that you work with. But initially, there is, I won't sugarcoat it, there is a lot of resistance to listen to or be even willing to engage in a dialogue with a young female designer. Okay, and of course my initial projects were not architecture projects, they were like tiny little things. um, it wasn't easy. uh, but what I realize is with like patience, perseverance, and just good communication, if you are able to get over your first initial phase of practice, then those same carpenters, plumbers, contractors do end up respecting you. And that's how you can start building a very, very trusted team. I mean, now having practiced for some 6 odd years too before I left, and then some 4 years since I've returned, uh, any one phone call, an honest conversation, even if I'm doing working drawings, and there'll be multiple times when I'll be like, I don't know how this junction will work, and I'll call my plumber and be like, भैया ये कैसे करेंगे, and invite him to the office, have an honest conversation about the fact that he's been doing it for 25 years, he knows it more than me, I don't have any ego whatsoever. And let's come together to figure out how we can work towards the betterment of the project rather than, satisfying or feeding into each other's ego. The other thing I always made sure when I started practicing was I'm a very disciplined, punctual person. So I would show up on site 5 minutes before the site meeting. Before the clients have arrived, before the contractors have arrived, I would be there. And I would wait. Like I would wait for half an hour, not say anything, and be like, अच्छा 9 बजे का मीटिंग था ना, मैं 9 बजे आ गया. I'll call everyone. Be like, अच्छा I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Like if there are 4 people coming, if the carpenter, plumber, contractor is coming, भैया मैं आ गई हूँ, आप आ रहे हो ना? And so they know, oh, okay, well she's already there, and we are late. So now there's also that kind of discipline and reputation saying, if it's my side, then everybody shows up because they know I don't take their time for granted, and so they've started respecting my time as well. The biggest, I think, resistance came not from people on site. I think they were very helpful, very they'll test. Okay, so when you start out, they'll have their own little ways to test whether you know your stuff or not, and it'll be very subtle, but they'll judge you. And once they have judged you, then you are fine. It's like, okay, madam is not all faff, thoda kuch to aata hai. And sometimes if you are honest and you bear yourself open, it's like, अच्छा ये नहीं पता मुझे, आप बताओ. Then it's also like, they feel कि हाँ, okay, I am respected for something, the skill that I have. The biggest resistance came actually not from site or from clients, came from being out in the open and going to all the showrooms and vendors. So if I would go into a tile showroom, for example, or a marble showroom, or if I had to go pick bathroom fittings. And this would be ridiculous because these are places where you would usually see a male architect, bring their design team and bring the client, and there's like a group of 6, 7 people going for selection. I would be here going doing the recce before I actually take the client there, making sure I know stuff. I've probably done like a primary selection. And I'd be waiting there. Hopefully, somebody will come show me stuff, somebody I can ask questions. And finally, at the end of the day, after asking, it's like, Acha, bhai, koi aayega? Can like somebody guide me through the showroom? They'll come with a usual form because they have to note down who came for the visit. They'll be like, Acha, your name. It's my name, Vaishnavi Shukla. In Gujarati, by default, I can't count the number of times people have said, Behan, tame interior ne? And I was like, nah, હવે ladies architect હોય છે. So they'll check their interior design architect. કોની ઓફિસમાંથી આયા? Whose office are you from? Not recognizing the fact that we now live in a day and age where women can run their own practices. I was like, nah, I live marriage, it's my own practice. I don't work for somebody else. What's your practice's name? It's like, currently my own name is the practice's name. And then it's brutal, it's shrewd. They'll be like, Acha, what is your requirement? Probably hoping that I'm there to select like one thing, two thing. And then you'll be like, no, this is, like a 5-bedroom residence I'm doing. It's about 11,000 square feet. And then suddenly they're like, oh, madam, pani lenge aap? And then it starts from there. Come, I'll show you around. And then you start asking technical questions. So they know suddenly it's like, oh, she knows her stuff, Madam, chai coffee lenge aap? And then suddenly that person realizes that they were wrong all around, that things have changed, This young girl who's come here actually might give me business. And suddenly there's a shift in their attitude. And then that would happen every single showroom I used to go to, And everybody would do that. Ma'am, aap interior ho? Not even interior designer, which is it's like disrespect to anybody who's an interior designer. It's like, why would you even just say that? It's like, are you a designer? It's fine enough, And then having to do that again and again and again. But I did it multiple times, as many times as I needed to. And so now when I go to any of the usual places that I go to, they know that I mean business. They are willing to work with me regardless of how big or small the project is. But it's a matter of time. And even today when I go to construction sites, it's usually only me and maybe like 10 other men. I've been on project before we kickstart a project. We would have a huge meeting where all consultants are there, all contractors are there, clients are there. I would still be the only person. But it's okay. It's fine. I consider it a privilege to be the only woman on site, and which is why by design or intentionally up until this April, everybody in the office, the team was also all women. Not that I was biased or prejudiced, but I just felt like if I could show somebody else how they could do it, and even if one person goes and starts their own practice knowing it's possible, then my work is all done. But now we have guys, so it's not like I'm biased. But yeah, it's you have to be patient and you have to really just push through.
Absolutely with you on that. And I'd like to say thank you, Vaishnavi, for sharing this experience because yet again, it's kind of like an unseen battle and an overlooked conversation, but it is present, it is still present. It starts very small, it starts with subtle comments in architecture school, continues right into the field where you come across these experiences.
I'm not saying it becomes any easier. I mean, imagine I was doing that when I had all the freedom and I knew I didn't have to pay any bills to do it. Of course, when I got married, again there were people who were like, oh, she'll probably like mellow down once she's married. I've been married for 3 years now. No, it grew in size, And then I also have classmates who've now started having kids, and that is again a whole different conversation because What do you do when you go on maternity leave? You can't come back to site a day after having a baby. You need to have those 1.5, 2 months of rest because your body is not the same, and
Right.
it does affect business. It's not easy, and there's no male partner to rely on. I have a lot of classmates who've married each other, and so when the female goes for maternity leave, the male partner would take over. But then what do you do when it's a small team, single female principal, and you're just going to disappear for 4 weeks? So it's not easy anyway, and there are n number of things that work against you. But I think if you want to figure out, and if you're in it for the long haul, might be a little bit of a lull, but then I think you can always pick back up again.
I think we have talked for a long time, and I just have one last question for the conversation. Uh, what do you plan for the future? What do you want to go ahead with in regards to your practice and in regards to architecture of center? Adding to that question, what is architecture for you? You know, where do you start? Where do you end? I know it is like an everlasting question. You never know. No one has a definite question, but I like to ask this question particularly to every practicing architect.
I think I've thought about this multiple times, and I'm not a dreamy poetic person. So it's less about space and this and that. I think, in a slightly more brutal pragmatic sense, I think architecture is all about selection of the best alternative, and it's about hardcore decision making. You can interpret it however you want, but it applies to all phases of architecture. So for me, it's just been, there are X number of options for something. What is your rationale for picking up this option? How do you justify it? Whether it's design, whether it's execution, whether it's selection of projects, whether it's team building, and it's about that decision making. So it's broad, but that's how I look at it. For what's next in terms of practice, we are we are growing as a team. So that's something that I'm very excited about, is just building a close knit family, where we are all able to learn from each other, keep it small always. I don't aspire to have like a 50% large firm, but if I'm able to have a small team where everybody is fulfilled, where everybody is learning, where uh, everybody's enjoying, then that's work done for me. In terms of the kind of work we are doing, of course, the eventual goal is to be able to have one part of the practice that's focused on making design more accessible, giving back to the society, and hopefully be able to work with CSR projects or non-profits in terms of uh, using our skills to do something better for society. Because the kind of work we do right now is, we do a lot of houses, we do a lot of offices. A lot of these projects are, have bottomless budgets, but then how do you really um, make it for somebody who doesn't have the the luxury of hiring an architect, or living in the spaces that we design for others. So that's, hopefully that happens a couple of years down the line, when we're able to funnel part of the income from the projects to kind of invest in other stuff. For architecture of center, we are at the end of our Graham Foundation grant year, which was for 2 seasons. So I think 2 more episodes to go, and we'll wrap up season 6, and then we'll start thinking about what's next. So yeah, that's about it.
And that is all for our chat today. If you enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe to us on Spotify and follow on Instagram for updates. Thank you for listening.